Every time a player hears roll initiative, there's a certain energy in their body that changes as they know that things are about to get real, and the same goes for the Game Master. Let's talk about that. Hey fellow Game Masters, welcome back. I'm Richard Quiner, and today we're talking about combat in role-playing games, the third pillar or part of an adventure that is how you can make a great story. Last week we talked about social interactions, and I mentioned that that's the part of role-playing games that has the least amount of rules. Today we are doing the exact opposite, where we are doing combat, which is the most rules-heavy part of role-playing games. The reason there are so many rules for combat in role-playing games is because it is the most game part of it. It is where there is a direct conflict between the players and the NPCs, and it's designed to help everyone have a fun and fair time while making tactical combat decisions. That being said, the rules are kind of, even though there's a lot of them, there's relatively easy to learn, which is why for this video, I'm trying to not focus on the rules and just focus on how you as a game master and you as players can use this combat in your storytelling and use it to elevate the combat from just a simple board game sort of scenario to a storytelling moment at your table. Now, to get to that point, we need to understand why we fight. Why is there combat in these tabletop role-playing games? If we look at a literal sense, it's because it's fun and it's something to do. And when Dungeons and Dragons was first made, it was kind of based off of a combat game scenario. So that's why it came into play so heavily. But in a storytelling sense, why do we fight? And why do we use it as game masters to compel our players into bigger and better things? The first, simplest reason that we do it as game masters is to drain the players of resources. Players and characters in general have a very limited amount of resources in their tabletop games. In each game, there's usually a limit on how many spells they can use in a day. There's a limit on how many healing potions they carry. There's limited amounts of things they can do at a time, and we use extra combat to kind of drain those resources to create a sense of kind of dire need or dire urgency. When like a big boss fight comes, if they're drained and haven't rested and don't have a lot of spells, it's much scarier than if they face a boss first thing in the morning when they're well rested and ready to go. So draining player resources is one of the first reasons why we use combat in our games. The second reason that I like to use it is to mark an achievement, and this is basically a boss battle. Every time there's a boss battle, that's usually kind of an end to a chapter or an end to a paragraph of story, and that can be emphasized by using the combat with the boss battle. The players know if it's a boss battle, they know something big is happening, that they know they accomplished something real, and using this boss battle is a good way to kind of just put a little emphasis on that. It doesn't mean that's the only way to mark an achievement in the game. Sometimes you can have achievements in the game without having combat come into play, and that's good too. And the last reason that I ever use combat in my role-playing games is when the players and an NPC come to a moment of conflicting desires and there's no other way around it. My players in my game generally are trying to get away without fighting. They're not super fighters, they just want to, make progress, they want to get things done, and a lot of times they talk their way out of situations. But every once in a while, things just come to a head, and that is when you throw down. So now a couple tips for game masters when you're in a fight. Remember this, the rules you should already know by now. You should have read up on those and understood them, but how do you give a little more flavor and make the fights a little more interesting? Well, the first thing you can do, or the first thing I should say you should not do, is just constantly do the same thing. If the player hits you and you just say, oh, I hit you back, or so-and-so hits that player, you're just going to do the same thing. If you just keep doing that over and over again, it just becomes a slugfest, where it's like, oh, player 1 hits you with their longsword, enemy hits you with their longsword, player 2 hits you with a longsword, and player 4 hits you with their longsword. And that just becomes very monotonous and doesn't give any flavor or interest to the table, and the players can feel that when you're doing that. When you're doing that at the table, the players get that sense as well. So to avoid that, you need to be as descriptive as possible and change up your routine or your actions while you're playing. Also, encourage the players to do the same. Encourage the players to get really descriptive with their combat. When the players are taking their turn and describing what they want to do, encourage them to do it with more detail. The more detail, the better, and the better picture it will paint for everyone else at the table. There is a method I learned about how to be more descriptive. I learned from the Don Forgecast, who is another YouTuber about role-playing games in general, and he described it, a pretty simple technique that I enjoy doing when I remember to do it, because sometimes I get in the heat of battle and I don't remember. But as a player, here's a quick tip. When you are at the table, first off, you gotta pay attention to everyone else around you. Then when it's your turn, do a quick little recap of what the other player before you had just done, and then take your turn. For example, if you are the party rogue and the barbarian has just smashed someone into the ground with their axe, describe it. Say, see, as so-and-so, as barbarian smashes the Kinku wizard into the ground with his axe, and then do your turn. This way it ties it all together, because remember, in a combat in a game, it's very quick. Everything's happening fast. Everything's basically happening at the same time. Initiative order is really there just so there's some sense of order to the chaos that a fight is. So keep that in mind, that, just because it's your turn doesn't mean a lot of time has happened. So remember that as you're describing things, that you can be in the midst of things. You can even describe your reactions to something that happened 3 turns before you. There's a lot of different things you can do with this to make it more immersive and build the world, you as a player and you as the game master. As the game master, if you're controlling a big bad villain, if this is a boss fight, here's a little thing to make it more interesting, and it's to give them something a little extra. In D&D, they call it legendary actions. In Pathfinder and other systems, I'm sure they all have something. But if you're running a character that's already been done, like if it's a pre-published boss, make sure you read the stat block that they give you, because that will give you some information on any legendary actions that character has. If you came up with this character on your own, still give them a little extra. It'll even the fight out a little bit, because if it's 1 against 4 or 1 against 5, it's kind of a lopsided fight. But it gives you a chance as the GM to have something a little more unique go on. So in a recent game that I ran, we had a bad guy that I made, and part of his legendary actions was if he got hit, he could try to touch someone and send them to an alternate space for a short term. And that was something that could come into play, a certain amount of times in the game. So it made them stronger, but not too strong. That's legendary actions, or as I call it, a little extra. So keep that in mind as you're playing your big bosses. Try to make them feel like a big boss, something that's real powerful. I like the idea of conversation during a fight. And I'm not talking about a full-on conversation with, a lot of back and forth between the players and the enemy, but I do like the idea of saying things, communicating during the fight. And I let my players do this as a free thing. Like, at the beginning of the round, they can say something. At the end of their turn, they can say something. Whenever they want, they can just say something. And I don't make it be like an action or a bonus action. It's just a free thing. And usually I will allow 1 response. That's my rule of thumb, is one call out and 1 response, and that's it. Because it's only a 6-second time period, but that's enough, especially while you're swinging a sword, you can be saying something. They can multitask. So I embrace that, because it builds kind of the characters can communicate as their situations are changing, and it makes for an interesting flow of the game where it's not just relying on the map or the picture that the GM is painting, but the players get to paint a better picture and communicate this information to their adventure party members. And they can also do things like taunting the enemy, which is really fun when, the players decide they're gonna, taunt the bad guy or say something negative, and the bad guy can also taunt the players. There's a lot that you can do just by saying, yeah, talking is fine during the fight. You can have conversations, but try to limit it for the amount of time you actually have. Realistically, in a 6-second time frame, you don't have the time for someone to give a full rundown on the current situation to another person. They might have time for like 1 sentence or like a half a sentence, a much shorter time period. So keep that in consideration, but try to include some conversation in your combat. In addition to the conversation, I like to involve the rule of cool, and it's been coined several times by other YouTubers and other notable game masters. It's just the idea that if the player wants to do something that's not specifically written in the rule book, but it sounds cool and it'll make for a neat story moment, let them do it. If you have to roll for it, sure. But if the player wants to run up, a big monster's back and stab him in the back of the head, a la Legolas, that sounds cool. Do it. It's a fun time. You might have to make them roll, a dexterity check to get to the top, or something, or you might just have them roll to attack. It's your choice as the GM, but I think you shouldn't limit your players to, oh no, you can't realistically run up this guy's back because it's, not listed in the book. Try to think of what is cool, paint a cool picture, and what will be fun for your players. When running combat, there's a couple ways you can do it that we see in the streams and in the public. There's different ways of running combat. One is where you, as the game master, describe everything. The players just have to state what their action is, and then you can paint the picture with your words. This works out in situations where the players aren't really good with words, or they just don't want to. They might just want to say, I hit it with my sword. And then you as the game master can come in and kind of try to build more descriptive into it and try to make it more immersive. If the player doesn't, if the player just doesn't want to be descriptive, that's fine, and you can do that yourself. The other way of running it is have the players do it themselves. Have the players get descriptive with their actions. I, as a player, enjoy describing what I'm doing. It's fun, and I like it. I enjoy it as a game master when my players describe what they're doing. But I can't expect that from everyone, so I found a nice balance where everyone gets to do it a little bit. I also try to get the players to be more descriptive whenever they get a killing blow on something. It's just a neat thing, and they feel like they took ownership of it, and if they're killing a bad guy and they're like, I stab him in the eye and it goes into the brain, I let that happen and I don't fight it on it because they just killed the guy. Let them have it. And the last way you can roll combat is just very board gamey. You don't have to deal with being descriptive at all. You can just, 1 and 2 and action A and action B, and here's the dice and here's the numbers, and you don't have to paint the picture if you don't want to. That's just as much role-playing game as getting descriptive and trying to paint a good picture is. I personally like the more descriptive, painting the picture with words way of doing it, but I can also see the value of just the dice and the numbers. Just a couple things, thoughts for you to keep in mind as a game master while you're running combat is things that I found more difficult trying to do them myself. And the first one is finding a balance between you as the NPCs and you as the game master. I've mentioned in previous videos, you aren't the villain to your players, the NPCs are the villain, but in a combat situation, you want to be playing as the villains would. So you don't want to pull punches, right? You want to try to kill your players when you're the NPC, but there is a balance you need to find where instead of being an all-out, I'm going to kill the players, you still want to be a GM and you want to be on their side and help tell a good story. So it's a fine balance you need to find where you can go full, tactical combat against your players, which will give them a good time, but when it comes down to the moments that need to happen, you won't pull the rug out from under the players. You gotta be self-aware enough that if the players are beating you, they're gonna win, and you can't, just suddenly have a way around it. That's not fair, and that's not being a good game master if you just come up with, countermeasures for all the players' actions. But still try to play it like the NPC would. If the NPC is getting in a fight, they will make choices that will try to kill the players. Keep that in mind, and then try to find that balance in your game. It's a hard thing to do. I still work on it myself. I know a lot of people still try to figure this out. Something else to keep in mind is not all combat has to end in death. Just because the players get in a fight doesn't mean somebody has to die, whether it's the players or the NPCs. It's okay for everyone to come to a point and just walk away. Nothing wrong with that, and it's up to you and the players and how the game pans out to determine if that is a viable option in the moment. And I think sometimes those are good moments too. Or if a villain runs away, that's cool because that can be a recurring villain that comes back and faces the players again and again as they get stronger. So there's different options. So not all combat has to equal death of a character or death of an NPC. Keep that in mind. Sometimes players will overestimate the value or the power of the natural 20. In the D20 systems, the natural 20 is the critical success. Just because something is a critical success doesn't mean it wins the game. So in some situations, and this is more of in the social interaction time before a fight or leading up to something, if a player may want to try to convince a bad guy to, throw down or surrender. Throw down your arms, surrender, come with us. And that could be a persuasion check, and the player could roll a nat 20. But if you think realistically, if this is a big bad guy who's been trying to destroy the world for the last months, and the players are like, no, you're gonna surrender, would that bad guy really do that? Is that even possible? The best case scenario in those situations is the bad guy may consider it, or they may, hold that against the players. There's other options you can do where the nat 20 doesn't always equal win. It doesn't always equal this succeeds as the player has described it. It's okay to find a balance there, and it's something important for the players to understand too, is sometimes the nat 20 won't give you the result you want, but it will give you a good result that the game master, is trying to figure out for the story and tell a good story. That being said, don't be a jerk about it. Don't be withholding from your players just because it doesn't work with your story. Try to find a nice balance where you're telling the story together, and if the nat 20 happens to work and it still will make a good story, then go with it. It's fine. I had my niece, who's 7 years old at the time, she rolled a nat 20 convincing the big bad guy that he needed to stop fighting and just be friends with everyone so she could be friends with him. She rolled a nat 20 and it was Christmas time, so that worked. It changed the whole outcome of the game and it made for a good story for her. Decide what's good for your players. Players, in the last little bit, I just want to give you a couple tips to help you run combat a little more smooth at the table. So first off is be attentive. Don't be on your phone on Facebook or Twitter or whatever you're doing during the fight. You want to be paying attention to what everyone's doing, and while paying attention, you decide what you're going to do next. Paying attention to what's happening is the best way to have a good tactical combat situation versus the NPCs. In addition to this, part of a thing you can do, and something I like to try to do, is keep track of initiative yourself. The game master keeps track of initiative, but there's no rule that says the player can't write this down for themselves also. So if you keep track of what the turn is as you go through the first round, or as the GM reveals the turn and turn order, then you'll know when your turn is when it comes up, and you'll be able to be ready for it. Part of being ready for your turn, I like to think, is not just having one idea of what you're going to do, but have a backup plan just in case something goes a little amiss. And on top of that, have a default kind of action. I like to have a thing, if I am not coming up with a good idea, like if I can't come up with a good tactical decision in the moment, and my turn comes around, and I still can't come up with something, then I have just a default action that I do, and I do that. And then that way the story gets to keep moving, and things just keep moving ahead, and you're not holding up the story or holding up the game to try to come up with something. There are times when players will get a little too overboard with trying to decide the perfect task to do in the moment, and really when that happens, it slows down the game. If you have to take 5 minutes to describe what your character is doing, you're pulling everyone out of the story. They're sitting there waiting for you. They want your character to act. This is supposed to be a high-paced combat situation, and you're there being the one being like, well, I could do this spell, or I could jump over here, or I could do this. And if you're weighing all the options and you're not acting, it's just a courtesy thing that you're pulling all the players out. They're not having fun anymore. You might be having a great time doing this, but it's not just about you, it's about the whole table, right? So try to be ready for that when your turn comes, and make your decisions quick and snappy, and before you get to the fight, understand your character and the spells you have, so you can just really get into it. And I promise you, if you do that, you will have more fun. It will be more exciting at the table. Everyone will have a much better time, and you'll still have some good combat. That is combat in role-playing games in a nutshell. It's a lot to take in. The more important thing I think you need to take away from this is that combat can be a good storytelling thing, and you should find your ways to use it in your game. Don't just rely on just the rules as they're written in the books, but try to kind of embrace the different sides that come in combat and make it a dynamic, entertaining moment at the table for the entire party. I've been Richard Quiner, and thank you again for watching the video, and we'll see you next time.